Welcome everyone. I'm Steve Hunter of H-ISAC, and I am your Navigator webinar MC today. Today's webinar is presented by HYPR. The title of today's webinar is 10 million passwordless CVS users. HYPR is one of our trusted Navigator participants at H-ISAC, and today we'll have a brief overview of the passwordless decade, featuring Mr. George Avetisov, the CEO of HYPR, and Boyan Simic, the Chief Technology Officer of HYPR. Assisting him will be Brian Heemsoth, the Executive Director of Security Operations at CVS. He has a great use case, and he is also an H-ISAC member, as you may know. So, lastly, this is a H-ISAC Navigator webinar. As we said, all attendees have been muted. This webinar will be recorded for future use. Any slides presented here today will be available via a downloadable link after the webinar. You can pose a question by using the questions section in the control panel. We will open the webinar for your questions roughly between 40 and 45-minute mark. And without further delay, let's get into this great topic, and we'll ask George to set the table. George?
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining. Couldn't ask for a better audience. All you folks in the healthcare community. I'm sure we all wish we were together now in sunny Florida for the H-ISAC. I look forward to it every year, as I'm sure you all do. But no, really, from all of us here at HYPR, thank you for all the amazing work you're doing today. And thank you for making the time to spend today with us. My name is George. I'm the co-founder and CEO of HYPR. Happy to kick it off, Steve, but would love for Boyan and Brian to introduce themselves as well.
Yeah, Boyan Simic here, co-founder and CTO of HYPR. Happy to be speaking with all of you today.
And good afternoon, Brian Heemsoth. I'm the Executive Director for Security Operations, Incident Response, and Consumer Identity and Access Management at CVS Health. Happy also to be here talking with you all today.
Cool. Brian, I'm sure we wish we were in Florida at the H-ISAC, right?
I would much rather be there than cold, dreary Connecticut, most definitely.
Well, we're in cold, dreary New York City, so I think we share your joy. But let's dive into it. I think everyone came here to hear about passwordless, right? What does it mean? What does this talk about? Yeah, we wanted to make a simple agenda. I want to get to Brian's story and the CVS Health journey as soon as we can, but kind of to level set on what passwordless is and what this talks about. Let's spend a few minutes just understanding how has authentication evolved to where it is today. Let's ask ourselves, are we really living in the passwordless decade? I think this is worth looking into. You know, passwordless has been hyped for a long time. It's been talked about forever, but is it finally here? And hopefully Brian can, share his journey and their story with us to answer that question. But let's start with a little bit of stats, right? Everyone loves stats. We all like numbers. Numbers tell a story. In the past few years, we've seen a huge spike in credential reuse. When you look at account takeover fraud, volume has more than doubled in the past 5 years. When you look at consumer banking, 1 in every 2 online banking visitors is a malicious login attempt. And when you think about just the sheer amount of password reuse attacks, it's not a very optimistic story because we're over here doing so much as an industry to improve authentication, and seeing numbers like this definitely is concerning. So what's the cause? Why is this happening? When you look at the attacks, you'll notice that the cost of the attacks, the complexity of the attacks has decreased for the adversary, but it's gone up for the enterprise. It's gotten a lot more expensive to defend the enterprise, and it's got a lot cheaper and easier for the adversaries to attack. Cloud transformations have made a much larger attack surface. You've seen new tools like Sniper and Madlishka, make it easy for script kiddies and even junior level hackers to pull off large-scale attacks. Boyan, I think you made a good analogy recently about, I think you have a niece who's able to use a credential stuffing tool to launch a pretty large-scale attack on an enterprise, something how did you phrase it? You always do it better than me.
Yeah, I have a nephew who's who's very much into computers, and he's been able to in his research, let's say, he's been able to look at some of the credentials that have been stolen over the years, and very easily use off-the-shelf tools like the ones we mentioned here to potentially execute an attack on any global organization with a pretty decent success rate.
Yeah, and credential stuffing is kind of, it's accessible, right? A lot of people can pull it off, and it doesn't really require a high skill set. That's all coupled together with the fact that authentication and MFA adoption has surprisingly stagnated in the past few years. So how did we get here? Where are we going? That's a good question. Before we talk about where we're going, let's take a quick trip down memory lane. A lot of folks on this call have had experiences with different authentication technologies, passwords, two-factor tokens, phone as a token. And finally, if you kind of look at where we are, passwordless is really this evolution, right? This next phase of authentication. We're in the passwordless decade, as some people might say. But how did we get here? Let's take a trip down memory lane. We got passwords. Passwords haven't really changed in the past 60 years. The way they were used in the early days of the internet, they're still very much used the same way today. People share them, people lose them, people forget them, people make new passwords that are just slightly different than their existing passwords. And going back to the problem of credential reuse and credential stuffing, everyone has a son or daughter, niece or nephew who today is able to pull off a credential stuffing attack given some pretty generally available tools on the web. And that's because reused passwords have made it easy for attackers to essentially attack this single point of failure. You're only as strong as your users' passwords and where they've reused them before. So as we tried to raise that wall over the years, we came up with two-factor authentication. We had hard tokens. I think everyone here has some kind of memorable story with a hard token, right? You've got high friction, you've got relatively low adoption. I think it's been improving over the last few years. Boyan, you've used many of these, I'm sure.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories of this is, we were, before HYPR, I used to do a lot of security assessments for organizations. And one of my favorite stories is, we were walking through a global financial organization. And as we were, just walking to the conference room to talk about, this assignment and this project, I came across, a pod of desks. And at this pod of desks, they basically had a table in the middle, a round table in the middle, and that table had a RSA token taped to it with a password written beneath it on a post-it note. And so that was so that the people in that pod could very easily access the credentials in that token when, as they need to access some sort of sensitive account. It was kind of defeating the entire purpose of the technology, but it was just one of many examples of how people will try to reduce friction for themselves as much as possible, even if it's a detriment to the security of the organization.
I've seen drawers full of these. It's really something. And I think there's nothing wrong. It's easy to say how much we don't love hard tokens, but they definitely improved the security in the evolution of authentication. They were a next step. And we also saw smart cards who popularized PKI. Smart cards, you see them across the public sector, you see them in a lot of federal 3-letter environments. Brian, have you had much experience with smart cards? Do you guys use them? Have you used them? Sort of what is your kind of smart card journey?
Yeah, I mean, as the security tool, they can be effective, right? That's why they've had the run that they've had. The challenge comes down to usability And then platform support, right? You know, if you have a Windows PC, sure, you can get one with a smart card reader, but you're going to be relegated to a small subset of the market. And then when you talk about mobile and, you know, the ways that our users want to engage today, you're talking about really wonky or non-existent integration solutions. So, you know, definitely as the work, the method by which we work and the method by which our customers engage with us changes, the viability of old standby solutions like this is falling out of favor in our perspective.
Great, the niche adoption. I think that's an easy way to sum it up. You know, effective, took PKI, you know, to new places, to new heights. Definitely improved authentication, but not very mainstream. But when you look at SMS 2FA, there's mainstream MFA. There's a good example of two-factor authentication that I think everyone on this call is familiar with. You know, we have mothers, fathers, uncles, and aunts who are pretty familiar with SMS 2FA and know what it's for and know what these little codes mean when they arrive on our phone. The last couple of years have not been really kind to SMS two-factor. Brian, what is your kind of take on where SMS 2FA has come and where we're at today?
Sure. Well, you know, we've seen erosion on both fronts, right? You know, we have erosion as a viable MFA mechanism for high trust assets, right? You know, with SIM swap, with the different types of attacks that exist on the telco platforms and you know, on the nature of our mobile connectivity, right? You know, account takeover for carrier accounts leading to SMS messages being redirected, and all these different permutations that were never threat modeled when SMS MFA came along, right? And when we all first put it in. And then similarly, our users are finding that it's not conducive to the ways they want to engage with us, right? You know, they would rather get a push message on their iPad on the app that they're using than have to go get their phone in another room, right? And you know, there's a dual benefit there, both on the usability front and on the security front, to looking at different options.
And I think the popular kind of headlines we see are things like SIM swapping attacks, Bitcoin wallets being emptied. You know, more recently, we've got legislation that calls out SMS 2FA as kind of being outdated. NIST is no longer pushing this as a viable method. I think, you know, the sun has definitely set on this methodology, and we've seen a big rise over the past decade for the phone as a token MFA. So Brian, you alluded to kind of the push notification as an authentication, right? There's a lot of these. I mean, everyone on this call is familiar with apps like, you know, Duo or RSA and, you know, great phone as a token MFA tools that did us, I think, all a huge service in taking that concept of 2FA and making it accessible through the mobile app. How far did it really get is a good question. So one surprising metric, I think this was surprising to all of us when it kind of came out last year, was that adoption globally has stalled. And it's stalled in a meaningful way. When you look at the Internet Trends Report and other reports surrounding adoption of MFA in the enterprise, adoption by customers of the enterprise, you'll notice a pretty concerning trend. First of all, adoption of MFA for desktops, workstations, has been surprisingly low. In fact, it's rarely used. Customer MFA, logging into your bank's website. Remember that earlier stat about how many malicious login attempts there are on banking sites. Customer MFA adoption has been less than we'd like to see. And one of the top reasons is not technological necessarily. It has to do with the user experience. People feel that the combination of passwords and sort of these legacy MFA methods has been really slow. You're logging into your desktop many times a day. You're logging into your bank's websites pretty often, making payments that need to be fast and easy. this MFA stack that we've had has kind of reached its plateau. You can see this in global adoption, and you can see it every time one of your employees or one of your customers has to use legacy MFA to log in. They're never smiling. You'll notice that they're never happy to do it, and it's more of a user experience problem than we like to think about, because it's the user experience component is something that's not that scientific, right? It's more art than science, but it's definitely there. So where are we? Well, customer and MFA adoption and desktop MFA adoption has stalled out. Pretty much everybody's still using passwords, and you know, a 12-year-old can successfully launch a large credential stuffing attack on a major enterprise with tools that are available on Google. This is pretty much where we're at after 60 years of innovation in the authentication space. So why are we here? What's the underlying problem? Before I hand it off to Brian to sort of go over the solution. Well, cyber hasn't really experienced its transformational moment. When you look at security, you'll notice that it hasn't really had its kind of cloud moment or its transformation. Boyan, you have a kind of a good thought on this as to why, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if we look at, you know, some of the transformations in technology over the last couple of decades, we really haven't had one in security. Our friends over in the mobile computing space, you know, mobile has changed significantly over the last 20 years. You know, we have these modern day supercomputers in our pockets, whereas, you know, a decade and a half ago, we had something much simpler. Even the way that we create technologies, you know, going from the traditional waterfall methods to the new agile methods that are, you know, prevalent now in the industry, you know, we've seen that occur over the last couple of decades. And then the major shift from on-premise, you know, data centers and computing to cloud computing, it's been tremendous. And we've seen the values and the ability for organizations to iterate much better. Since then, we really haven't had a transformation in the cybersecurity space. We've just kind of been, you know, putting a Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid, so to say. So
for all you in the security community, we like to think that passwordless is the transformation you've been looking for. It's finally time, and it's finally possible for this to happen. I think we've seen all these other methods plateau. We've seen kind of the users revolt. You know, we've seen the bad guys take advantage of what we've been doing all this time. And passwordless is that transformational moment, we believe, in cyber, where you can do a webinar on 10 million passwordless users and be able to speak to the benefits of it finally today. And, you know, with the announcement of passwordless by companies like Google, Microsoft, you know, you're finally seeing that stamp of approval from the big players. You're seeing Google call this the true passwordless era. This is a good way of describing that what we've been living in before has, you know, it was different than what we're living in now. The best way I want you all to sum this up, just the way we think about it, is that we're going from an environment with legacy MFA. We're moving from an environment where shared secrets are the hacker's favorite target, where passwords, PINs, and OTP, one-time passwords, are not only expensive to defend, they're also difficult to use, and they've created a gap. Everyone on this call has some type of MFA gap. I think we can all relate to that. And it's these legacy methods that we've been trying to Band-Aid together that have caused it. What Google, Microsoft, HYPR, CVS Health, and the companies pushing this technology forward are saying is that true passwordless allows us to move away from the shared secrets, allows us to move away from passwords, and move those keys out of the enterprise, give them back to the user, essentially make it expensive to attack these users, make it easy for them to use authentication, strong authentication, and finally address that customer MFA gap and solve that desktop MFA gap. Before I hand it off to Brian, you know, the message I would leave you all with is think of true passwordless as an evolution beyond shared secrets. Try to think about how it's allowing us to move from a target that's expensive to defend to an organization that's expensive to attack. Something that's easy to use, something that's easier to defend. This is the outcome of what we're talking about here. And the way you want to explain it to your partners, your users, your boards, is it's kind of like a smart card on your smartphone. People ask Boyan all the time, how do I explain this to my team? How do I convey this in a manner that's really simple to understand? Brian mentioned earlier, smart cards were great. They had a very strong, they still do. They're very effective when used properly. And the smartphone has allowed us to transform the smart card into the smartphone. That's an easy way of thinking of true passwordless MFA. The adoption of this technology is pretty much seen across the industry. Gartner has, I think it's ambitious, but Gartner's predictions are, sometimes on point. Seeing more than half of large enterprises adopt passwordless by 2022. Seeing a lot of the mid-size going passwordless. I think this is a really strong push in that direction. And without further ado, I think it'd be a great opportunity for Brian to kind of comment on that adoption and share his journey with us for CVS Health. Brian?
Great. Thank you, George, and thank you everyone else for having me here and joining us this afternoon. I do hope that everyone can hear me okay. I actually had a power outage. Good. I had a power outage right as we were doing introductions, so there's nothing quite like the adrenaline of running around the house trying to get backup internet going and the phone back up and all of that while in the midst of the webinar. But I'm glad that we appear to all be online.
Brian, one word.
Yeah.
Incident response.
Incident response, right? Exactly, right. I have to be able to adapt to the unexpected and manage it successfully, right? So I gave a brief intro of myself at the beginning. I do work for CVS Health. I lead our incident response and fraud program within our and SOC program within the security organization at CVS. Prior to that, I held the same roles for Aetna, and that was until Aetna was acquired by CVS Health at the end of 2018. One of the great joys of my career in recent years has been getting to work with partners like George and Boyan on the passwordless journey and make meaningful impacts to our customers around improving the resiliency of their accounts by changing, like George said, that economic model around the attack surface of Aetna and CVS applications and creating an economic reality for attackers that the disparate nature of our credentials and our secrets doesn't create an enticing target for them. All right, George, next slide. So what I'd like to do today is walk you through that journey, and we'll talk about our starting place and how we came about embracing FIDO-based passwordless authentication and the growth that we enjoyed over the years in terms of expanding adoption there and the changes that we've gone through with that transition from Aetna to becoming part of the broader CVS Health brand, and how we've adapted our strategy as a result to hit a larger target customer base. And then finally, we're at a very exciting point in the growth of FIDO in terms of the widespread ratification of FIDO 2 and WebAuthn and what that means for bringing passwordless to web to join its mobile counterparts, which has been a cornerstone of our strategy, but one that there was a little bit of a technology curve that we were waiting on, an adoption curve that we were waiting on that's now finally here. So 2020 is definitely a very exciting year when it comes to passwordless in the consumer channels. And we'll also focus on the workforce use cases and how we're taking the same passwordless concept over to our many employees. Okay, next slide. So to bring you back in time, 2017, back at Aetna, we had what I like to call a target-rich environment when it came to making meaningful changes in the security stature of our applications that our consumers leveraged. So first of all, we had many applications, about 30, maybe even more than 30 if you get into all the variants, mobile and web applications that interacted with different aspects of our customer base, right? Medicare had one app, Medicaid had another app, the core business has another application, and then all these, niche specialty applications. So incredibly large attack surface from a mobile and a web perspective, and then the back-end APIs that managed all, or that fed all those applications as well. One thing they all had in common is a reliance on what we called binary authentication. So username and password without any risk context. If you had a username and you had a password, you were in, right? What this meant is our customers were incredibly susceptible to phishing and account takeover. And right about this same time, we started to see vastly increasing attention from threat actors targeting healthcare accounts for phishing, for account takeover, for different types of attacks on identity and on authentication. So it was really a significant storm brewing, right? We had the threat actors and their attacks, and then we had apps that were susceptible to these types of attacks. And to boot, we had a user experience that suffered as a result of those drawbacks in the authentication experience, right? By 2017, nobody wanted to use a username and password on mobile anymore, right? And our digital engagement was showing that. We have a situation where some of our users will just give up on an interaction if it's too onerous for them. And when a user gives up on an interaction, that means they don't gain access to our platforms, they don't gain access to our care information that we provide on those platforms, and now potentially we're contributing to a diminished health outcome for that individual because we're not giving them the resources up front proactively that we want to give them to help them manage either an acute or a long-term condition that they're dealing with. So, very significant trickle-down impacts here to our digital organizations in terms of the objectives they were trying to drive as a component of their digital transformation initiative, but an even more important trickle down or more critical trickle down to our customers, right? Ultimately, the goal of our company is to keep our members healthy and to give them the resources they need to maintain their health. And the less that we were able to have people engage with us via our apps and our web applications, the more hindered we were in doing that. Okay, next slide. So we very quickly worked to seize that opportunity, and the focus of our efforts was around exactly the model that George so eloquently outlined, which was FIDO-based biometric authentication for our consumer base, right? And we primarily brought this to our mobile users at first, so Touch ID and Face ID were gaining momentum in this time period, right? And also their equivalents on Android devices from Samsung and the other OEMs. And we were able to leverage the frameworks provided by HYPR and the SDKs provided by HYPR to deliver our authentication solutions on these platforms in a way that not only improve the user experience and that the user got that Touch ID that they were looking for, right? And they later got that Face ID. But we contributed to the resiliency of the enterprise against attacks on those consumer accounts by leveraging the FIDO-based passwordless authentication, which leaves the secret on the individual user's device and avoids the centralized storage of secrets and then therefore the presence of an enticing target for threat actors to come after Aetna for. So very significant dual benefit. We partnered this with other controls at the time. We also rolled out a significant browser and system fingerprinting capability for web to help manage some of that attacker risk that I was talking about there. That was all tactical, designed to get us through a year or two to really where we are now. and with the advent of FIDO2, right? The passwordless web-driven functionality that FIDO2 and it helps enable for us with WebAuthn is taking the web experience to where the mobile experience is now, and also addressing a lot of the shortcomings that exist in browser and system fingerprinting technologies, which honestly are eroding with every major browser release as Chrome and Firefox and therefore Edge as well make unique fingerprinting more and more difficult, which therefore makes browser and fingerprinting less of a viable control for us in our consumer space. All right, next slide. And the initial results were very successful, right? So one, we saw great growth in terms of our adoption of what we call the next generation authentication platform, which was this FIDO-based authentication solution. We very quickly, got up, 2 million, 4 million, then later to 8 and 10 million users. That helped us achieve our objectives we had in the security team. By the end of 2019 into 2020, we felt that we were pretty much providing the level of authentication and security to the population of active Aetna users, which was sort of mission accomplished in that regard for the Aetna business unit. But more importantly, we were helping a couple of other very positive outcomes. One, the work that we were doing in concert with our other digital transformation initiatives was helping increase our digital engagement in spades. And again, that's important, as I talked about earlier, because that helps us improve our patient outcomes and then reduce our interaction costs, right? If people don't get sick, as an insurance company, there is less in claims coming in addition to the consumer remaining healthy. A nice additional benefit to that has been seeing our security and fraud losses drop significantly as well. So if you chart it from where we were at a peak in 2016, coming out of 2015, we're down about 98.5% from there, which is a great SLA. And most of this is due to our implementation of effective authentication controls, which have, again, changed that economic model around the attacks against healthcare accounts and has made it difficult and complex to target Aetna consumers as compared to potentially other organizations. And therefore, we don't see the same level of attention from threat actors that we once did. All right, next slide. Back in 2019, everything changed. So Aetna was acquired by CVS Health as part of a very significant $69 billion merger. And this was a really exciting time for the security organization of the company, and in particular for the consumer authentication slash next-gen auth team, because it really changed the upside of what we were working towards, right? I talked about how we got to 10 million members, and we felt like we had encompassed the universe of active Aetna consumers, which is great. 10 million people is a lot of people, right? That's impressive. But what we were really aiming to do was change the state of authentication for all consumers of healthcare, right? And now as part of the CVS Health umbrella, we have the opportunity to do that. And, that's because we not only are, still one of the largest health insurers, but also have the largest retail pharmacy chain with, I think, around 9,000 or 8,500 stores across the country. We have the largest or second largest, I forget, mail order pharmacy organization, all rolled up into one, and that gives us a touch point of up to 200 million individual consumers across the country. And when your team's objectives are to change the way that consumers interact with healthcare from a security and from an authentication perspective, 200 million as your customer base is a great leg up and a great place to start. So that's been a very exciting transition for us, and one that we've worked in earnest to take these concepts that we have on the Aetna side of the world and bring them to our retail business and to our mail order pharmacy business to bring the fraud resilience and the security to one consistent level across the whole enterprise, and to allow our consumers, particularly on the retail side, to enjoy all the usability benefits of going passwordless on web and on mobile, and having the delightful consumer experience that we drive for as a result. Next slide. Simultaneously to all that, as if the merging of the companies was not enough, we also had a lot of exciting developments in the FIDO world. So between, I guess it was the middle of 2018 to the end of 2019, we saw all of the major browser development shops and operating system platforms come on board to the FIDO standards, right? So Google had been there for a long time, but the major milestones were Microsoft with Windows 10 and also their Edge platform, and Chrome and Firefox, and Apple, each at different points in that timeline, adding their support for native FIDO and FIDO2 based authentication and support for the WebAuthn standard. All of that allowed us to bring the same type of passwordless experience to our web users, which is the majority of our consumer users that we have on mobile. So from a security perspective, this allows us to replace those browser fingerprint capabilities that I talked about a couple of minutes ago as eroding with better, more secure solutions, right? And I say better both from a security perspective and better from a consumer experience perspective. So, from the security perspective, we're essentially replacing JavaScript identification of systems with a key that's stored on the device in a trusted execution environment, right? We are replacing the passwords that the users are used to leveraging with either native authenticators like facial authentication on their device, or a fingerprint reader on their laptop, or a push to mobile with, we're replacing the passwords with all of those better capabilities. And with that, we see a higher success rate, right? We've removed the I forgot my password complexity from our engagements. And we've also improved the speed and the speed at which a user can launch an interaction with our services, and therefore the frequency of how often they do. And especially in our retail business units, it's important that we're able to maintain not only the security of that platform, since we are a healthcare retail vendor, but that we provide that smooth and delightful experience. And this is a great way for security to do that. And it's been a great use case in bringing those features along as a result. Next slide. And then the last frontier for us, as it relates to our FIDO journey internally, is the expansion to workforce. And this is an endeavor that we're starting off on now, or have been engaged in now. We're working through our corporate deployments, and we'll expand to additional business units, retail users, and point of sale machines and such in the next year or so. But the goal is, again, to provide that same secure and delightful experience for all of our employees. And that's for local workstation authentication, for VPN and remote access, and for applications. And there's a couple of different ROI drivers on this, right? The more we move to a passwordless model and embrace the decentralized nature of the secrets, the less susceptible our users will be to phishing, which has a significant trickle down to our incident response and event handling costs derived through credential attacks, inclusive of phishing and others. And also, we're starting to see labor reduction, particularly in our help desks and our support staff, from eliminating password resets and taking that transaction out of play for those groups. And as you'd imagine, over a company with a couple 100,000 employees, the volume of password resets just adds up to absolutely crazy levels. And being able to reduce and eliminate that workflow is a significant value add for our IT and our operations organizations. Okay, next slide. So here's the exciting slide. Again, I told you on the consumer side, I was very proud of 10 million. The team's done great work, but again, the integration with CVS and the upside that that brings, creates a new opportunity for us, and one that we're working, that we're well positioned to succeed on, and working iteratively towards every day. So, I hope to come back and talk to you all in, a year or two, and, 10 million will sound small then. We'll be talking about how we're at 35 or 40 million, right? Because we've expanded, we would have completed our expansion to our retail and our mail order pharmacy environments by then. And, we would have brought that same level of security and the same level of experience to those users. So a lot of exciting times ahead on the consumer side. In terms of better security and better enablement for our business. And then on the workforce side, similar. We're relatively early in our journey, but having great results thus far. The testing and the target group work that we've done is all through the roof, and we're just in the midst of an iterative business unit by business unit deployment to bring these capabilities across all of our employees. So definitely a lot of exciting times there ahead for our workforce as well. All right, I think we've got one more slide here. Yes, okay, so, this has been a very exciting journey for me, and, certainly one where I've enjoyed just about all aspects of it. I've enjoyed working with great partners to develop technical solutions to address not only security concerns, but bring great solutions to our customers. I thought it would be helpful here to provide some keys to success and some things that I've learned along the way, in hopes that we might be able to help each other for other organizations that are either in the midst of or looking at undertaking this type of journey. So right off the bat, I will tell you that this is one place where the interest of the CISO and security leadership directly overlaps with what your chief digital officer, your CIO, and your CTO, and your related business leaders are driving after, right? This is one security control where we absolutely can improve the user experience, and therefore improve the engagement rates or the success rates for the underlying business processes. And it provides a great opportunity for unification of mission and objective. And obviously, when you do that, it makes doing things like solving for funding challenges a lot easier. And it also, helps when you get your digital teams and when your IT teams on the same page and marching in the same direction, and working off a unified roadmap, just in keeping these types of initiatives moving along effectively. So that was there was one piece of advice that I could pass along to everybody. This would be the big one. Unify with the other leaders, understand what they're being held accountable for, and then, drive how the passwordless experience helps to achieve benefits, well outside the traditional security swim lanes that we often think of. Next, it's very important to understand where you're coming from a digital footprint, and therefore use it as an input into your architecture and your opportunities. Many of us are large organizations. We have many applications with points of consumer interaction, and having a unified approach to address authentication across those endpoints and across those points of interaction is critical, right? You want to take a risk-based approach, target the highest risk applications, the highest touch point applications first, and make sure that you develop your solutions in a way that you have common frameworks, common authentication hubs, and such, so you're not doing a whole bunch of rework for every application. Next, partner with a trusted vendor to deliver the reusable authentication frameworks for FIDO and FIDO2. I like HYPR. They seem like an okay group of folks, so and they've been good to us. So I recommend that everyone give them some thought. They've been a great partner for us over the years in terms of delivering solutions that are rock solid, particularly on the client side, which is where a lot of other partners that we've worked with over the years have struggled. It's critical that that code works well and that you don't have vulnerabilities in that code or flaws in that code that lead to authentication failures or other failures of your security system. And also you want that user experience to be good and stable, and HYPR has exceeded at both of those things, and we're forever grateful to them for that. I talked about this kind of with the first point, but the more that you can align to other key programs to take advantage of investment and engineering synergies, the better, right? We've done that a couple of times. First, on the consumer side, with digital transformation, by making the authentication solution and our overall identity strategy a core to that program. We were able to have joint messaging across our leaders and alignment in our funding requests and our strategies to help drive all of those initiatives simultaneously and bring things together quite well in harmony. We're now going through that again with centralization initiatives for our workforce IAM, right? We're going through a lot of transition as part of the integration of the two companies, as you might imagine. And that makes a big difference when it comes, and that creates a great synergy when it comes to implementing a solution like Passwordless for workforce. And then finally, I talked about the importance of a good partner for your authentication frameworks and your authentication solution. But it's also important that you work to develop this competency within your teams. And I say that both for what we're talking about here in specific with the authentication space, but especially for the broader identity ecosystem. These are incredibly complex areas, and it's important to have a team that you either hire or ideally develop that understands the business needs for your organization, can properly engage with stakeholders across your organization, and then understands how to apply authentication and identity competencies to address business needs that exist. And it's also important that you allow those individuals to spend some time working on innovation and R&D, because this space, particularly in the identity ecosystem and identity validation and things like that, is just changing constantly. We're seeing new risks, we're seeing new demands from our consumers, new opportunities to improve consumer experience and improve security. And it's critical that you give these folks a good chunk of their time and allow them to innovate and R&D and understand that some of the things that you spend effort on will never work out or will fail in some way, but the wins that you do have will be transformational for your business and likely sources of competitive advantage when it comes to engagement with your customers as compared to your peers. So that's all I've got. I appreciate your time here today, and I believe our plan is to do some Q&A now.
Spot on, Brian. Perfect. 10 minutes for Q&A, and thank you for an awesome session, Brian. I think everyone learned a ton from that. And why don't we open it up to the floor? Steve, any questions coming in?
Yeah. First of all, a quick one about budget. You had to know, huh, Brian? How do you convince management to fund a passwordless initiative?
Sure. I'll tell you how we did it on the consumer side, and then we'll get into the workforce. But regardless of your integration model, it's important to understand the ecosystem that you're looking to implement it in and what challenges you're solving for, right? So customer side, we were solving for fraud, incident response, and consumer experience, right? So our business case encompassed all of those factors, right? So we had very clear figures of how much money we were losing month over month from account takeover fraud. We had, similarly from our incident response program, a very clear breakdown of what we spent in what I call the hand-to-hand combat of dealing with those incidents. And then finally, we had an understanding of where we were from a digital engagement perspective, and where we wanted to be and what we were missing out on by not having our digital engagement at those rates in terms of the business impact from not getting our customers the healthcare data and healthcare resources that they need. And we encompass all of those in our finance request and our investment plan. And that was done with all of those stakeholders that I talked about. So CTO, CIO, CDO, all of us had to be on the same page. And that helped immensely with us getting the funding, right? It's similar for the workforce too, right? We looked at the costs of our current reliance on passwords from an incident perspective, from phishing incidents that we'd realized over time. Also, we talked about our reliance on passwords and the impact that we have there for help desk and other types of transactions. So definitely want a very thorough business case that's focused around your implementation model that you're targeting.
Okay. We know the question that just came in, and that is YubiKey hardware needs.
I think, Steve, there was a question. I think the exact question was, does YubiKey address sort of the passwordless MFA concept for the workforce? Am I reading that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. No, that's an awesome question. For folks on the call, YubiKey is a great example of a hardware token. Huge fan of it. It has really brought sort of the concept of passwordless to the workforce. You've seen some great deployments at companies internally for employees logging in to various applications. I think the couple of things that I would point out, just from our experience with customers who have shifted from a hardware token like YubiKey to a mobile-centric passwordless approach, the things that stand out are first the costs of a hardware token. This talk is about 10 million passwordless users. Those 10 million users already have a phone. To ship them 10 million hardware tokens is not only cost prohibitive, the logistics of it make no sense. I think you would be hard pressed to find any organization trying to convince their customer base to use another device, especially a customer base that loves their phones so much. And that also applies to the workforce. So costs is one big component, but also logistics. When you have a workforce that, I think today it's very relevant, a remote workforce, who has mobile phones, who has laptops and workstations in their home environment, having to worry about another device to log in when they can use their phone, I think it's a pretty tough ask. I think people like using their phone, especially a remote workforce who is just constantly digital, constantly connected. We've had customers who were going to purchase 2 YubiKeys for every employee. The reason is their employees, especially the remote workers, are known to lose these keys and then have to replace them. So oftentimes you see an organization buying 2 for each user. Once they deployed passwordless MFA with the phone, with HYPR, they ended up no longer needing those hardware tokens, or at least needing far fewer than they thought they were. So hopefully that answers the question that yes, there's certainly a role for these technologies, and yes, they do a great job, in niche environments, but scalability for a hardware token is a huge hurdle, and that's why the mobile phone has really brought passwordless to the mainstream. Any other questions?
Yeah. A really good question. I think it's directed at Brian, and that is, when do you expect to have your workforce converted to passwordless?
Yeah, great question. So I would say that we'll be relatively quick within the 12 or 18 months that follow from here on out to deploy to our corporate users. So PCs, Macs, those types of devices. where we'll turn our focus to then would be in the sort of the niche aspects of the enterprise, right? Our retail POS systems and things like that. So I would say, you know, across our highest risk users, our corporate users, within the next 18 months or so, and probably within the next 30 months or so for the broader ecosystem.
Okay. I don't know why, but it seems like CVS is on the top of people's mind right now, Brian. Do you intend to use Passwordless for your call centers?
Yeah, great question. So we didn't get into it here today, but the next generation authentication program is omni-channel, right? In that we do provide consumer authentication solutions for our call centers, and those encompass a couple of different technologies. One is push-based authentication to mobile devices that we work with HYPR on, and another would be voice biometrics and other types of solutions that we're rolling out to complement that bridge to mobile that we're doing.
All right. A couple minutes left for questions. This one is kind of a two-parter, talking about resource investment. How big a team would this require to deploy, and how long does the average deployment take?
Great question. So we currently have 5 people that work on the next generation authentication team that's responsible for that 10 million user base. So we feel that we've been able to be pretty effective in terms of our resource allocation. And I do think a lot of that came down to the partner decisions that we made, right? And leveraging stable solutions for our application integrations in particular, and for our backend infrastructure to that don't require a lot of hand-holding from our perspective. As far as the integrations, generally, they're relatively quick, right? So yeah, we've got a pretty good run book now for bringing a new application on board, and the SDKs, the code is relatively simple to implement. We have good resources that we've worked to develop for our development teams, which helps a lot. So, you know, generally you're looking at a couple of sprints, a couple of 2-week sprints, and some meaningful progress. So, you know, it's absolutely not necessarily a heavy lift to make significant positive impact for yourself.
All right. Well, I think we're just at the top of the hour. I just wanted to mention that if anybody has any questions that they didn't have time to slip in, please forward them to me, and I'll pass them on to George and his team, or Brian. My email is very easy. You've probably seen it around. It's shunter@h-isac.org. And thank you all very much for joining us today. And thank you to Brian and George and Boyan. Wonderful webinar today. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.